Greetings, friends. I am Vitaly Portnikov. Kim Jong-un has also joined the club of dictators blackmailing American President Donald Trump. And indeed, why is it possible for Putin, but he cannot, especially since Donald Trump himself talks about his good relations with the North Korean dictator almost as often as about good relations with Putin, and calls Kim Jong-un the leader of a great nuclear nation. At the last session of the North Korean pseudo-parliament, Kim Jong-un noted that he was ready for negotiations with the United States, of which he had the warmest memory if Washington abandoned its policy of denuclearization. In other words, it recognizes the nuclear status of North Korea. And, as an alternative to these talks, Kim Jong-un called the escalation on the Korean peninsula increasing when he announced that North Korea would have a new secret weapon. While observers are wondering what kind of weapon it is. However, it is obvious that military technical cooperation with the Russian Federation, which only intensified after Kim began to supply shells for the Russian army and fighters for its formations, could lead to the fact that the Deepak army could really have a new type of missiles. We are not talking about their quality and efficiency now, but it is obvious that with such threats, Kim Jong-un wants to force the American president to meet with him and agree that North Korea will have nuclear weapons. I am not sure that the American administration will agree with such an approach. But on the other hand, I do not rule out that if nothing happens with blackmail, Kim Jong-un will, if we speak in the language of Vladimir Putin, proceed to military technical actions against South Korea. After all, it is very indicative of the fact that in the same speech at the session of the North Korean parliament, the dictator not only refused to even consider the very possibility of unification with South Korea at any time, and this, as we know, is a completely new political direction in the Deepak, but I refuse to ever sit down at the negotiating table with the leadership South Korea. And this is despite the fact that the new South Korean administration has repeatedly declared its readiness to resume dialogue with North Korea, interrupted by its predecessors. However, there is exactly the same formula that is present on all such negotiation platforms. It is impossible to agree on anything with Putin if he does not want any negotiations, but strives for the destruction of Ukrainian statehood and the expulsion from the territory of Ukraine of those who consider themselves Ukrainians. It is impossible to agree on anything with Hamas if the main goal of the leadership of this terrorist organization of its supporters is the destruction of the Jewish state and the expulsion of all Jews from the territory of Israel, in order to then create a Palestinian state within the borders of the entire former mandatory Palestine. It is impossible to agree on anything with North Korea if its goal is the destruction of the statehood of South Korea and the control of the North Korean communists over the entire peninsula. Moreover, as we know, this is not some kind of political fiction. Such control was established by the founder of the communist dynasty, Kim Il-sung, and the South was liberated from the communists and their Chinese allies only thanks to the actions of the United States and the collective West, ways within the United Nations peacekeeping force. Therefore, in all cases, we see the desire of dictatorships to restore what they consider the status quo. Ukraine without Ukrainians is part of the Russian Empire. Palestine without Jews is part of the world that existed before the restoration of Jewish statehood. South Korea is without people who want to develop a democratic sovereign state. Because now that the political situation is changing every day. For those who believe in the possibility of achieving these goals, they are becoming more and more tangible. The idea that it is possible to achieve any results through diplomacy is another illusion. At the same time, it is clear that dictators and terrorists are confident that they can blackmail Donald Trump as much as they please. Let's recall how many times the American president wanted to take tough measures against Putin. He postponed them every time, because warm relations with the Russian president and the opportunity to talk about these relations are much more important for him than any harsh measures. Let's recall how many times Trump threatened the leadership of Hamas if the terrorists did not release the hostages. So what? Hamas simply ignores Trump's statement. The only thing the terrorists have to react to is the Israeli army. Remember how many times Trump talked about his good relationship with Kim Jong-un. Why then can't the North Korean dictator believe that he is capable of blackmailing the American president and getting what he wants from him if Trump became the first leader of the United States, who in fact made Kim Jong-un an invaluable gift of the legitimacy of the head of the practically communist-occupied part of the territory of the Korean state? The state, which is fully perceived only by the Soviet Union and its satellites, and has always been seen as a time of education, which sooner or later give way to a unified, democratic Korea, where there will be no dictators and their threats. It is now clear that North Korea is a nuclear state. Many may question that sooner on the Korean peninsula. The country's communist dictators and democratic South Korea, especially if Trump will take their obligations to protect South Korea about the same as it relates to their responsibilities regarding the protection of the European continent against possible Russian aggression. In fact, Kim Jong-un has every reason, to my great regret, to feel confident and comfortable while dealing with such opponents. Thank you, friends. Stay on this channel, subscribe to it, subscribe to my social networks 4 channels in Patreon, BAME, Coffee and Donatello, which helps to develop these resources. Use the sponsorship function in YouTube itself.